The following message is brought to you by the Ezra Institute for Contemporary Christianity. To learn more about the Ezra Institute's mission to advance the Lordship of Christ, please visit www.ezrainstitute.ca.
Most irresponsible, disgusting pig alive in the world.
Shut up for a second, please.
We're in a cultural war.
How do you think you are talking to me like that? I resent the fact that your implication that only you are a Canadian.
The culture war is back.
All right, my friends, the culture war is on. Here it is. We're back to work. It's Tuesday already, and we get into the deep end of things with the Culture Warriors. Scott Masson is the associate pastor at the Westminster Chapel in Toronto, and he's rejoined the Oakley Show. Good morning, Scott.
Good morning, John.
Morning. And Justin Trottier, spokesperson for the Canadian Secular Alliance. Good morning to you, Justin.
Good morning to both of you.
Thank you for that. By the way, it was Friday. It seems like it wasn't that long ago we were discussing this issue in anticipation of a Supreme Court ruling, and it came out and perhaps surprised many because it was a unanimous 9-0 or 9-0 ruling from the Supremes that anyone who has HIV but is deemed to be a low risk to spread the contagion, in fact, has a low load HIV status, being treated by antiretroviral drugs or wears a condom, doesn't have to disclose their status. Whereas back in 1998, I guess, when this was first contested, it did lead to charges and convictions for aggravated sexual assault. Failure to disclose could, in fact, lead to a death sentence, as indeed it did in the case of one individual whose conviction was upheld. The other was quashed because the woman was deemed to be a low risk to pass on the contagion. Well, did the Supreme Court get it right or wrong? Scott Masson, I'll start with you.
Well, I thought they got it wrong in overturning the ruling. I was surprised at the 9-0 ruling, so clearly they were clear amongst themselves on the justice in overturning it. But I would have thought that the mere possibility of transferring a deadly virus would be enough that at least they would want to hold to the previous ruling that you ought to reveal to your sexual partner the possibility that they may contract the virus. That's all that the law stated, is that there was a moral obligation to reveal that. The new legislation seems to me really funny. That they have to have a low load of the virus. What does that mean? It seems to me to open all sorts of legal challenges, among other things. I mean, what constitutes a low level? Who's going to determine that?
Well, what you're saying is even if the chance is negligible, it's still something you have a moral obligation or duty to disclose.
That's right. And so for that reason, I found it a very odd ruling, and I couldn't understand why they would overturn the ban. And it's in accordance with the medical science as they understand it right now, but who knows if the virus is going to mutate and become something else. They don't know it. So to overturn the legislation seemed to me a very hazardous ruling.
Well, I guess the other argument is if the legislation had been kept as it was in 1998 when antiretroviral drugs had not progressed to the extent they had and mitigated the danger, let's say, or the risk, that left too many people in the precarious position of being charged with the rather serious charge of aggravated sexual assault and sent away for a long time. So do you think the Supreme Court got it right or wrong, Justin? Or which do you feel? Do you think they got it wrong?
I think they got it more or less right, and I just want to say right off the top that I share the kind of intuitive gut reaction that there's something bad about this decision, although it does follow from the World Health Organization's recommendations that we do look to decriminalize or kind of roll back the more stringent criminalization of failing to disclose. Right now, Canada actually has one of the harshest legal regimes in the world, and it's a legal question. I agree on a moral level that it may be wrong to fail to disclose, but we're talking about the law. Mm-hmm. And Canada does or has until now treated failure to disclose as basically murder, whereas in many other countries, the law provides for reckless endangerment. That's how they refer to it.
Actually, it was
or
aggravated
purposeful
sexual
infection.
It was aggravated sexual assault was the charge.
It was, but there were cases, I think, where people were charged with murder. In maybe some of the cases where more than one person was infected. In other jurisdictions, it's more often manslaughter. So I think there was a necessity to reevaluate the 1998 decision. But again, whether they actually got it right with the kinds of conditions that they're imposing, I'm not sure if the conditions go far enough, to be honest. But I think there is another concern, which is if you had kept it the way it was, there were cases, it seemed to be a big problem, where people were purposefully not getting tested because then they wouldn't have the burden to disclose if they didn't have they didn't have tests showing that they were HIV positive. So I think all of this got into that mix of considerations. And I'm not sure if maybe this went too far in the other direction. But I think what they did have in 1998 was probably causing more harm than good.
All right. So in other words, we can't just leave it up to the people, or if people are going to be socially irresponsible or they won't live up to some kind of a higher moral ideal, we need laws to conform or to be shaped in order to, bring them up above board to encourage them to disclose. In other words, because they weren't even finding out what their status was, just so they wouldn't be in this precarious position of needing to disclose, not wanting to disclose. That's kind of a curious way to apply the law, isn't it, Scott?
I think it's a very funny way to apply the law. But I do think it has a particular lobby group behind it that's very powerful. It is predominantly the gay community that is afflicted by this illness, despite there's been some objections to that, but the statistics demonstrate that that is the case. And I think part of the reason the legislation did come forward is precisely because this particular illness was being stigmatized. It was being singled out as being particularly dangerous. And, apparently there are groups that were saying, how come other illnesses that are also damaging, harmful to others are not being similarly stigmatized? So this particular illness, so that was part of their objection to it.
Well, it was to make the rules consistent because, as you say, now that the medical advances have taken place,
right,
there are STDs that are on a par as far as causing harm. If infection happens from one partner to another. So
like
there was an idea that there was a kind of stigma. And just to your point about this being a gay lobby, I mean, most of the cases in my research, there aren't actually a lot of cases where people have been tried in the courts for sexual assault or aggravated assault on the grounds of causing HIV infection. Most of the high-profile ones were actually men to women or women to men. It wasn't within the gay community. So I'm not sure if you can blame the gay lobby for this.
Oh. Well, I don't know.
Well, yeah, this is where they went to court because the one that was quashed was a woman who had infected male partners, and the other one that I guess was upheld because the guy's been deported, but it was with female partners he did. Yeah. And then there was a story about, what's his name, Senyonga, I guess, who also infected some women knowingly, and I believe he was charged with murder. But therein lies so you believe that this might have been the Supreme Court acceding to the wishes or will of the gay community or gay lobby, is what you're saying, Scott Masson.
Well, the issue itself had always the appearance of that to begin with. That was part of the objection, and I do think that there is, in general, in the legal landscape and the political landscape, a move to accommodate that particular segment of the population. There is an identity politics, and it seems to be at least a motivation to hear this particular case. Why would they hear this case and not others? That's part of the Supreme Court's decision to begin with. Why are we going to hear this case and not that case? Is there something that has changed here? To me, the ruling in
medical science.
Well, right. If medical science is an issue that's going to change legal and political debates, then the abortion issue would be opened up, but we're not going to touch that, right? So there's a
Fair
complete
enough.
Right,
yeah.
And yeah,
it is a point well made. Still with identity politics, then. Story that we covered late last week. Sherry DeNovo, the NDP MPP for Parkdale High Park, sponsored a bill, Bill 33, Toby's Act, the right to be free from discrimination and harassment because of gender identity or gender expression. And the way it's made itself into our discussion this morning, the Toronto District School Board has a document out called TDSB Guidelines for the Accommodation of Transgender and Gender Nonconforming Students and Staff. And it's just the pedestrian concern of washroom access. It says all students have a right to safe restroom facilities and the right to use a washroom that corresponds to the student's gender identity, regardless of the student's sex assigned at birth. Requiring students to prove their gender by having a doctor's note or identity documents is not acceptable. A student's self-identification is a sole measure of the student's gender, and they can use whichever washroom they deem to suit their identity. Scott Masson, I'll start with you again. Is there anything flawed with this thinking or this line of proposing gender equality for transgender student and staff?
It's hard to know where to begin with such a bizarre policy and such a bizarre mode of thinking that severs sex from gender. My other hat that I wear is I'm a professor of English literature, and I do specialize in literary theory. Now, the literary theory that lies behind the distinction between gender and sex has been growing in academia for the past 50-odd years, and it's intensified to the point where people will say that there is no correlation between gender and sex. And such is the case here. They talked about sex assigned at birth. What does that mean?
Well, how you're anatomically constructed or biologically, were you born male or female? Yeah,
no, I understand that, but the word assigned at birth, you're not assigned it. You're created that way. You're born that way. You're not assigned it. Nobody tells you this, and you can't overturn it. The idea that our sexual identity is somehow a mental state is part of the problem here. When you inflict a policy that allows children to think of their gender in contradistinction to their sex, then you create all manner of confusion. I think it's a form of child abuse, the TDSB's policy on this, because it allows children to think of themselves in some other fashion than the one that they're biologically determined to be. Now, I realize there are cases of confusion there, but this propagates confusion. It promotes it. And it's on a practical level, I think it makes it impossible to enforce, and it opens up the possibility of rampant abuse. I'm a male, and I'm going to go into the girls' washroom. Who is going to tell me that I'm not a predator? I mean, how am I going to distinguish the predator from somebody who's genuinely confused? I just think it creates all manner of...
Somebody here is genuinely confused.
You don't have to talk about yourself like that on the air, Jenner. But
well,
anyway.
Justin, all right. So you think Sherry DeNovo, because her explanation was that transgender kids typically are bullied, have a greater incidence of suicide.
Absolutely. Look, we can debate. Yeah, I don't think either of us are authorities on this, but we can debate. The 6 different genders and the difference between gender and sex and all those interesting debates that are happening in social science and sexology, I guess it's called. But to me, the evidence is that transgendered people suffer higher levels of discrimination, suffer bullying, are more likely to suffer poverty. I mean, these are real issues.
That's true.
You can talk about issues to do with who walks into washrooms.
Right.
And I think we already have safeguards in place that protect people from pedophilia. Maybe those need to be strengthened, but that's a different conversation. The conversation here is how to protect transgendered people. We have gay rights that's been enshrined in human rights legislation. This is a very sensible expansion of those existing rights, and I think it makes eminent sense. It had all party endorsements.
It lacks any sense, actually, and it's not sensible in any way, shape, or form. But
so, what do you do in a case of somebody?
Little controversy and had high-level endorsements from members of every party.
Again, speak to my previous point about a powerful lobby and the way it dominates Canadian politics.
All right, well, let's then ask about that. Gender identity, is that really identity politics playing itself out, this new idea that, it's relatively new, the TDSB guidelines for the accommodation of transgender and gender nonconforming students and staff. Is there a need to accommodate such students, or is this just, again, something that's being full throttle, being foisted? Certainly within the school system, which is another issue, if it's, kind of the gateway to... what do we call it? The normalization?
It's the normalization. Sure it is.
All right. Is it taking place in schools because identity politics are being promoted here against the best interests of the overall society?
And the children. Yep.
And the children might be the argument. Let's find out how the folks feel about it with Scott Masson, again, Associate Pastor at the Westminster Chapel in Toronto, and Justin Trottier, spokesperson for the Canadian Secular Alliance.
This is for the rare individual who is identified as trans and not just by themselves, that they be allowed to use the facilities that, yes, is theirs, which is if they identify as a woman's, a man as a man's. And again, very rare and always backed up with, we hope, of course, some adult support.
All right, well, that was Sherry DeNovo. She was talking about Toby's Law, or Toby's Act, Bill 33, that she sponsored, and I guess she said all three parties supported it, for transgender folk to be able to self-identify which washroom they want to use. And the Toronto District School Board, in its current guidelines, allows for self-identity. And we're discussing whether or not this is the right approach. Scott Masson shaking his head. Justin Trottier believes, I guess, that, it's necessary to implement something like that to protect the vulnerable, who are particularly vulnerable given the stats and so on and so forth. But, Scott, you believe that this is a symbol or a signal of something larger at play in our society or in our culture?
Yeah, we were talking about that in the break. I think that it is the new norm is that there is no norm. The normative understanding of human sexuality and its proper place for being exercised is within the confines of a marriage between a man and a woman. That norm has been erased, and legislatively we're moving and bringing in different understandings, orientations. Even the language has changed. Sexual orientation didn't exist 15, 20 years ago as a description. Now it's all the rage. Everyone talking about their orientation. And again, it is not only opposed to the understanding of the proper place of sexuality, it's against human biology, so that you can speak of gender as opposed to your sex. And to me, it propagates confusion. And I don't know how you can teach right and wrong, truth and falsehood, when there are no norms except what you think is right. I mean, why even bother going to school?
1 + 1 will still equal 2 after we accept the fact that transgender people exist. There are still norms. Pedophilia is wrong. Nobody's suggesting.
Well, for the moment it is. For the moment, it's wrong.
That's a little bit disrespectful.
No, it's not, because there are conferences. I
don't hear
North
anybody
America.
fight. I don't hear De Novo or anybody fighting for this particular
I'm not saying
piece of legislation.
Of course
or
not.
Others in the gay community who are suggesting that it's a slippery slope.
It's there in academia as we speak. There are conferences that promote it.
If you accept the fact of the existence of gay people or transgender people, or give them the same rights and protections everybody else currently enjoys,
they had the rights and protections.
It's a slippery slope towards bestiality and whatever other sins you imagine are likely to prevail.
No, all I'm saying is that you either have a norm or there is no norm. Currently, there's no norm. If there's no norm, then what you call beyond the pale, namely bestiality or pedophilia, what would you point to that would say that this is absolutely wrong? There's nothing there.
Well, what I'm more concerned about is people who are suffering. And I think that the evidence
as a pastor,
is
I have the same concern, but there are ways of doing that.
Not because they're confused, as you put it, but because the law doesn't provide them the respect and the opportunities and the same protections, and confuses them by suggesting that their biology is somehow corrupt or sinful. That's where the confusion comes from. It's not their biology,
it's their gender, which has nothing to do with their biology. The point here is that law has nothing to do with pastoral care for people. You don't promote laws, or you don't bring in laws in order to protect people. People protect people. Laws won't do that. The law is an instrument for implementing something.
Oh, but it certainly sends a message. I mean, it's interesting that when sexual orientation was implemented into the human rights legislation, and it became protected, and it became something of interest to the Human Rights Commission in Ontario, you and I have certain agreement on the Human Rights Commission's abuses.
Yeah,
in this particular case, I think that sexual orientation is and needs to be a protected. That needs to be a protected group. When that was brought in, the cases that were brought to the Human Rights Commission actually dropped, partly because a signal was sent that Ontario was not going to accept that kind of abuse and discrimination. That does send a signal. This will send a signal, and that can help.
It does send a signal. It sends the signal that nobody knows what anything's about, but there's a hush on free speech as a consequence. Look, children who were gay...
Does free speech have to do with anything in this particular debate?
That's why the cases aren't being brought forward, is because people aren't willing to talk about things anymore. There's no conversation that is permissible.
Most of the cases had to do with people being removed, in some cases,
Scott, you're saying there's
with very little warning from their housing because they're gay. What does that have to do with free speech?
Well, you're saying there's a chill if you do raise a flag and you dispute that this is the new normal.
That's right.
You get shut down or worse.
Of course, because the ruling's in place, and that's the way it is. Yeah.
All right, well, we'll come back. I'm going to take some calls. I beg your patience in advance. For those who've got a line, hang on. We'll come back, extend the segment with Scott Masson and Justin Trottier. Culture War continues on the Oakley Show. Talk Radio AM 640. All right, we're back into it. Scott Masson is the associate pastor at the Westminster Chapel in Toronto. Justin Trottier, spokesperson for the Canadian Secular Alliance. A lot of calls in this one, whether or not Toronto District School Board, just following up with Bill 33, Toby's Act, the right to be free from discrimination and harassment because of gender identity or gender expression, making washrooms available to the kids depending on how they identify themselves. No other proof necessary, no documentation. It's all about the onus on the young people. And I'm curious if this is even an issue that's got some practical need. I mean, how many kids actually identify as transgender? Anybody have an idea? Justin, would you think that there'd be more than a handful or more than one or two? I mean, at what age does this manifest itself, by the way?
Yeah, it's a small group. I mean, I was looking up the statistics on sexual orientation generally, and gays and lesbians account for just a few percent. I thought it was higher. It's actually just 3 or 4%. Statistics can vary, but it's about that. Yeah. So transgender is, somewhat quite a bit less than that, I guess. But I wouldn't know exactly in an average school how many or when they would sort of come out as such.
Well, I guess I'm wondering in practical terms if this has any real merit to be promoted, or is this more about politicizing something here, Scott Massey?
I think it does. It just does the wrong thing. There are those who actually do have a confused gender identity, to use the phrase. Genuinely do. I think they're very confused people. Justin was right at the outset when he spoke to this, and the suicide rates, they're nigh on 50%.
Right.
And these are genuinely tormented people. That is a pastoral problem. That is genuinely a problem that you need to deal with, but you deal it on a personal pastoral level. You don't bring in legislation to somehow publicly identify and all of this stuff. All that this does is, as we talked earlier, it creates a new norm of sorts. And it encourages people and children really in the teenage years, their gender identity is sort of fluid. Human sexuality is very plastic in that sense. And putting it out there is something that we're going to recognize. It does encourage children who are a bit confused to become more like that. And again, I think that's why I talked about the child abuse. It allows kids to get in the position where they're so tormented that when there's no norm and there's no real outlet for it.
So you think this tormenting, this suicide, all that negative stuff, that's a product of this kind of legislation?
I think this legislation could lead to the rise in transgender or transsexual
There have been transgendered people, unfortunately, committing suicide long before there was legislation to deal with those problems.
Right.
And
as
to the question of the exact and absolute numbers of people who are transgendered, I hardly think that's the concern. The numbers that are important to me, at least, and to people that advocate for this, are the percentages, as Scott said, that commit suicide, that are denied housing, that live in poverty. Those are the percentages that matter. We're not putting a lot of resources into this problem. To be fair, we're amending the Human Rights Code in a sensible way. We already have sexual orientation protected. This is
but
just
now we're applying it in the schools at school level where, Karen's email says, grade 3 transgendered boy. I say if this is as common as this, that so many young kids are truly having this problem nowadays, we need to pour money into an emergency study as to why our genes, our DNA, or what have you have become so corrupted, is her word. Let me take some calls on this. Robin Whitby, thanks for waiting. Go ahead. You're on the Oakley Show.
Hey, good morning. Yeah, I just don't understand how schools ever got the mandate to tell our kids that whatever gender they think they are, that's what they are. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. I think it's wrong-headed. A gender identity disorder is a disorder.
Yep.
And these people that have it, they don't need a cheering section for the disorder. They need help. They need to have some kind of treatment.
Well, that was Scott's point.
That's my point. That's my point.
Is the school, see, this is the point that Robin Whitby's making, Justin. School is not the place to social engineer around
It's not social engineering. School is the place to provide education about the facts of the world around you. Well, just as the sky is blue and atoms are composed of, neutrons, protons, and electrons,
and
there are
transgender
people. That's a fact.
No, it's not.
Well, that's what we disagree on, but the science is pretty much in. There are gay people, and that's a biological, natural thing. It's seen in the animal kingdom, for heaven's sake.
Male and female
There
is
are
biological.
transgendered people. There are bi people. So, I mean, you can't argue with those facts. Now, you can say that
sexual orientation is not the same thing
legislation
as sexual identity. So you're male and female. The actual application of that is not a scientific fact.
You can talk about how proactively bringing in teachers who happen to represent certain demographic groups, that maybe that goes too far, maybe that unfairly privileges one group over others. I'm sympathetic to that kind of argument. But teaching children that it's okay if they feel these inclinations or this is who they are, that's just a fact, and it's as true as the facts of science and math, and that is the role of education, of public education.
Let me go to Maria next. Hello, Maria. You're on the Oakley Show.
I just want to tell Justin that education is to teach math and reading, and not to teach our children morally false things that you are speaking of.
You think education should include civics, for example? Social engagement?
You've been speaking the whole time. We should not address our kids in any way whatsoever in the way in which you're speaking. Everyone agrees with me. Our whole family, all of our friends are very concerned about the TDSB and where it's heading.
Well, I agree with you. I agree with your concern about the TDSB and where it's heading. I do agree slightly with Justin that education also includes moral teaching and civic teaching, however. It's just that this morality and this understanding of the body politic is not one that is cohesive to the public good. We were talking about that in the break. The public education system should be there to promote the public good.
Well, I'd like to see evidence that teaching people that transgender people exist has created this moral confusion, that it has even created more transgendered people, because there's no evidence of that either.
That's because it hasn't yet happened. We're just bringing in the policy.
The policy is new, but you don't believe that they haven't talked about the existence of transgender people in the public square or in public schools before? Sure they have.
Really? I can't remember it in my classes.
But you would promote that, Justin. You think that that's part of a civics course, as it were. You were making that reference.
Well, for example, demographics is part of a civics course, teaching children that there are X percentage of blacks, whites, Hispanics, etc. within our society.
That has nothing to do with civics.
It's the same kind of fact when you're talking about demographics of sexual orientation. I don't see the difference.
I can see we're at loggerheads on this, so I'll end on this question because we'll have to move along. But there's a story out of Ottawa where the Conservative government, I guess under austerity measures, have decided only Christian chaplains would be ministering to the inmates in federal penitentiaries. And Bob Ray and Hyde Dudgeon, along with Thomas Mulcair, suggesting that this is a breach of the charter right, freedom of religion and expression. Is Bob Ray or Thomas Mulcair right about that, or do you think there's a case to be made for only Christian chaplains and the others to, I guess, minister to Buddhists and Jews would have to do so on a volunteer basis?
I dispute the premise that either of them can ever be right, but on this particular issue, no, I think not. Look, they cut 49 part-time chaplains, 18 of whom represented non-Christian faiths. In other words, 2/3 of the chaplains part-time that they cut were Christians. So I don't really see the issue there.
But they kept all the full-time Christians and cut every single staff person who's non-Christian.
They cut all of the part-time chaplains in order to save money. The case could be made that they ought not to be paying chaplains at all the public.
I would make that case.
Okay,
or just hire them part-time so that you can have a mix of different religious chaplains. Look, there are so many different options that they had to spend the same amount of money to save the measly $1.3 million that they're saving and still give proportional services. Of course, there's going to be more Christian chaplains or more hours of Christian chaplaincy service than Muslims because there are more Christian inmates than Muslims.
No, there aren't. The Muslim inmates are rising by the day, and there's a radicalization in the prisons.
Recheck my data. I'm quite sure there are more Christians in prison than Muslims.
Right, because anyway. There are also 2,500 volunteers who provide religious services. They're volunteers, and they're still allowed to do it. It has nothing to do with freedom of religion. And who are the volunteers? I think you would find that the overwhelming majority, if not almost the exclusive composition of these volunteers would be Christians. So if you really want to cut the funding for it, then you could do so. But the reality is that the Christian faith has a particular calling to the poor and the marginalized, the prisoners, and therefore Christians have gone there.
Well, certainly when you pay them to make a profession out of providing those services and don't provide the same
funding
financial
issue is, to me, a separate issue.
If you want to members of other religion, you're going to get more Christian chaplains who are willing
Christians
to step up and go into prison.
will go there whether it's funded or not. If you want to defund it, defund it.
As will members of other religions, but that's hardly the point. The point is that there were all of these different options for spending the same amount of money or cutting the same amount of money and still keeping, as I put it, a measure of support for non-Christian
So, Justin, you see it as religious discrimination.
There's less of them.
You think the Harper government's promoting a form of religious... All right, well, there you go. We'll leave it at that. Obviously, the two did not agree, which makes it a great day for talk radio. Scott Masson, Associate Pastor at the Westminster Chapel in Toronto. Justin Trottier, spokesperson for the Canadian Secular Alliance.
Thank you for listening to this message brought to you by the Ezra Institute for Contemporary Christianity. Please feel free to share it with friends, but do not charge for or alter the material in any way without the express written consent of the EICC. Thank you.